On the morning of June 19th, the floor of the Pacific Ocean moved. A magnitude 6.6 earthquake off the coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula in the far east of Russia. Then another, and then a third. 3 quakes in barely a day, all stacked into the same 20-mile patch of seafloor. Here's the part almost nobody mentioned. That patch of ocean is the same one that produced a magnitude 8.8 back in the summer of 2025. One of the most powerful earthquakes recorded anywhere on this planet in years. And that fault has not gone quiet. It's still settling, still slipping, still sending tremors up through 3 miles of water, more than 3,000 miles from the nearest American shore. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what woke up under the Pacific this week, why the shaking was never the thing to fear, and why the scientists watching this fault did not relax when the all-clear came through. This is the Horizon Lab, where the title sells the fear, and the rest of the video gives you the truth, because the truth here is stranger and colder than any conspiracy. Let's get into it. The United States Geological Survey looked at that June 19th quake and issued a green alert. No expected deaths, no tsunami. And that was correct. This one was not the one. But I want you to sit with a single number, 5 hours. That's roughly how long a wave borne off Kamchatka would take to cross the open ocean and reach the shoreline of Hilo, Hawaii. 5 hours. And here's what makes that number so unnerving. For most of those 5 hours, the ocean looks completely, perfectly normal. The sun is out, the water is calm, kids are walking to school along the bay, and the thing that's going to rearrange the coastline is already moving, out past the horizon, where nobody can see it. That's the gap this whole story lives inside. The gap between the moment the ground moves somewhere far away and the moment the water arrives somewhere you love. Do me a quick favor before we go further. Subscribe if this is the kind of thing you want more of. It genuinely keeps the channel alive. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because a few of the coastlines in this video are American ones, and some of you live on them. So let's be precise about what actually happened, because precision is the whole point here. The shaking off Kamchatka was real. The aftershock sequence is real. The 8.8 that came before it was real, and it was enormous. But the green alert was also real, and it was right. All of those things are true at once, and holding them together is the only honest way to talk about this. What I'm not going to do is tell you a wall of water is coming for the West Coast this weekend. It isn't. Anyone telling you that is either guessing or selling something. What I am going to do is something more uncomfortable. I'm going to show you that the events that killed Americans by the hundreds, on American soil, in living memory, started with a day that looked almost exactly like June 19th. A distant quake, a quiet sea, a green light, and then, hours later, the water came anyway. Here's the open loop I want you holding on to for the next hour. The wave that should scare you is never the one you can see. By the time you can see it, the decision that saves your life has already been made, or already been missed. So the real question isn't what the ocean is doing right now. The real question is whether you'd know what the ocean was telling you in those 5 quiet hours before it spoke. Most people in this story didn't. Stay with me, and you will. Let's go to the spot on the map, because geography is destiny here. The Kamchatka Peninsula hangs off the northeastern edge of Russia like a long, crooked finger pointing down into the Pacific. It is one of the most seismically violent places on the entire planet. And it's there for a reason. Right offshore runs the Kamchatka Trench, a place where 2 of Earth's tectonic plates are colliding in slow motion. The Pacific plate is diving down, underneath the plate that carries that coastline, at a rate of about 3 inches a year. That kind of collision zone has a name. Geologists call it a subduction zone, and subduction zones build the biggest earthquakes the world has ever recorded. In the summer of 2025, that trench let go, a magnitude 8.8. To give you a sense of scale, every step up the magnitude scale is roughly 32 times more energy released. So an 8.8 isn't a little bigger than a 7. It's in a different universe. It was one of the strongest quakes recorded anywhere on Earth in years, and it rang the whole peninsula like a bell. A quake that big doesn't just happen and end. It leaves the crust around it bruised and unstable, and the ground keeps adjusting for months, sometimes years. Each of those adjustments is its own earthquake. We call them aftershocks. and that's what arrived this June. On June 19th, the USGS logged a magnitude 6.6 about 130 miles east-southeast of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the main city on the peninsula. Almost in the same breath, a magnitude 6.0. The next day, June 20th, a magnitude 5.8 in the same little box of ocean, roughly 21 hours after the 6.6. Textbook aftershock behavior. The fault is still talking. It's just finishing a sentence it started last summer. Now here's where I have to be the kind of channel I promised you I'd be. For all three of those quakes, the USGS pager system, the tool that estimates human impact, returned a green alert. Green means no significant casualties expected, no significant damage expected, and critically, no Pacific-wide tsunami was generated. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center did not light up the way it would for the real thing. So why are we even here? If it was green, why does this fault deserve an hour of your attention? 2 reasons. Let me take them one at a time. The first reason is that this exact stretch of seafloor, the Kamchatka and Aleutian arc that curves from Russia toward Alaska, is one of the main tsunami factories aimed directly at the United States. Not the contiguous states first, Hawaii, Alaska, and then, on the long waves, California, Oregon, and Washington. When this corner of the world produces a great earthquake, the people who feel it worst sometimes live 5 hours away by wave, and they're American. The second reason is more human. Every single time this has happened in the past, the danger didn't announce itself. The ground shook somewhere most Americans had never heard of. The forecasters did their math, and the people on the receiving coastline had a window, measured in hours, to make one decision: move to high ground or don't. Most of the people who died in the disasters we're about to walk through did not die because the science failed. The science, in the modern cases, worked. They died in that gap. The gap between the warning and the wave. The gap where the ocean looked fine. That's the thing about a corner of the world that won't sit still. It keeps writing the same letter, and it keeps mailing it to the same addresses. The only question that's ever really up for grabs is whether anyone reads it in time. To understand why a quiet green alert quake and a coastline erasing monster come from the exact same place, you have to understand what's physically happening down in that trench. And I promise this is worth it. Because once you see the mechanism, the fear stops being vague and starts being specific. Picture 2 enormous slabs of rock pressed against each other at a shallow angle. The Pacific plate, sliding down and under. The overriding plate, getting dragged and squeezed on top. In a perfect world, they'd slide past each other smoothly, a few inches a year, and nobody would ever feel a thing. But that's not what happens. The 2 plates don't slide, they stick. Think of a zipper. When a zipper works, the teeth release 1 pair at a time, smoothly, top to bottom. Now imagine a zipper where the teeth are jammed. You keep pulling. The fabric on either side bunches and stretches and stores up tension, more and more, while the jammed section refuses to move. That jammed section is what scientists call a locked zone. Along the Kamchatka megathrust, the fault locks, and the rock behind it bends and loads with elastic energy, year after year. Like a steel ruler, you keep pressing harder against a desk. And then one day the jam fails. The locked zone gives way all at once. Decades of stored bending snap back in seconds. The seafloor doesn't just shake, it jumps. It can lurch upward by several feet across an area the size of a small state. Here's the piece that turns an earthquake into a tsunami. When that slab of seafloor jumps up, it shoves the entire column of ocean water sitting on top of it upward too. We're talking about trillions of gallons, lifted in an instant. Gravity immediately tries to flatten that bulge back out, and that collapsing bulge becomes a wave that races outward in every direction. That, mechanically, is a tsunami, not wind pushing on the surface, the way normal waves work. The whole depth of the ocean, set in motion, from the bottom up. That distinction matters enormously, and it's where most people's intuition fails them. A wind wave is a surface ripple. You can dive under it. A tsunami is the entire water column moving as one. There is nothing to dive under. It's less like a wave, and more like the sea level itself suddenly deciding to relocate. So now, you can see why the same fault gives you both. A magnitude 6.6 aftershock, like the ones in June, releases its energy without that big vertical jump of the seafloor. The water barely notices. Green alert, but the magnitude 8.8 or worse ruptures a huge locked patch, throws the seafloor upward, and lifts the ocean. Same trench, same plates, completely different outcome. The variable isn't location, it's how much seafloor moves and which direction. There's one more wrinkle, and it's a nasty one. Some of the deadliest tsunamis in history came from earthquakes that felt almost gentle. There's a rare type seismologists actually call a tsunami earthquake, where the rupture is slow and quiet, so the shaking feels modest, but the seafloor displacement is huge. People on a nearby coast feel a long, soft rolling, shrug it off, and never run. The 1946 disaster we're about to get to may have been exactly this kind of event. The ground lied to them. The ocean didn't. Let me say that again, because it's the hinge this entire video turns on. The size of the shaking does not reliably tell you the size of the wave. A gentle quake can carry a monster behind it, and a violent quake can carry nothing. The only thing that decides it is what the seafloor did, 10 miles down, where nobody can feel it. Which brings us to the threat the title of this video actually promised you, because so far we've talked about the ground, and the ground was never the real problem. Here's the turn. The shaking is the announcement, the wave is the event, and the wave does something that genuinely sounds like science fiction. In the deep open ocean, a tsunami travels at around 500 miles an hour. Read that again, 500 miles an hour. That's the cruising speed of a commercial jetliner. There is a wall of energy moving across the Pacific as fast as the plane you take to visit family, and you cannot see it, and you cannot outrun it, and for most of its journey you wouldn't even know it was there. Because out in deep water, a tsunami is almost invisible. The energy is spread through the entire depth of the sea, so at the surface it might only be a foot or two high, stretched across a wavelength of 100 miles or more. A ship in deep water can have a tsunami pass right under the hull, and the crew will feel nothing at all. Nothing. It is a flat, silent, 500-mile-an-hour freight train, and the ocean gives it a perfect disguise. So what happens when this invisible, jet-speed energy reaches a coastline? This is the cruel physics. As the wave moves from deep water into the shallows near shore, the bottom of the wave starts dragging on the rising seafloor. The front of the wave slows down, but the water behind it is still moving fast, so it piles up. The wavelength compresses. All that energy that was spread through a mile of ocean depth has nowhere to go but up. The wave stands up. It rears. A surge that was 2 feet tall in deep water can rise into a wall of water 2, 3, 4 stories high as it climbs onto the land. Scientists call that maximum height. The wave reaches on land the run-up, and run-ups from these events have reached 50, 60, even 100 feet. Now combine that with the distance. A great quake off Kamchatka, or the Aleutians, sends that energy radiating out across the whole Pacific basin. Hawaii sits almost dead center in that basin. It is, geographically, a bullseye. Tsunamis from Alaska, from Chile, from Japan, from Russia, from the Southwest Pacific, all of them converge on those islands. And the travel time from the northern Pacific to Hawaii is roughly 5 hours. 5 hours. Hold that against what you now know. The wave is invisible in deep water. It moves at jet speed. It only reveals itself in the last moments, when it climbs the shore and stands up into something monstrous. So for 5 hours, the most dangerous thing in the ocean is also the most well hidden. The warning, if there is one, is racing the wave, and the wave does not get tired. Here's the second threat, stated plainly, the one the headline promised. It was never the shaking. People on the US mainland barely feel a Kamchatka quake, if at all. The threat is a wave that crosses an entire ocean while the sky stays blue over the place it's heading. The threat is the calm. The threat is those 5 hours where everything looks fine, and a family on a beach in Hawaii has no idea that a decision made by a seismologist 3,000 miles away is the only thing standing between them and the water. And I want to be scrupulously fair here, because that's the whole brand. The June quakes did not do this. They didn't move enough seafloor. No transoceanic tsunami was launched, and the warning center correctly stayed dark. That is genuinely good news, and you should hear it clearly. But it didn't happen this week is not the same as it can't happen. This corner of the Pacific has launched that exact wave before, more than once, at Americans, and the only reason you may never have heard the full story is that some of it happened before you were born, and the rest happened to a town most people on the mainland couldn't find on a map. So let's go there. Let's go to Hilo, on the morning of April 1st, 1946. Because everything we've just covered, the locked fault, the quiet quake, the 5-hour silence, the invisible wave, all of it came together that morning into the deadliest tsunami in the history of the United States, and almost no one saw it coming. It was just before dawn, on the other side of the ocean, that the trench let go. Out near Unimak Island, in Alaska's Aleutian chain, a great earthquake ruptured the seafloor. Its magnitude is still argued over to this day. Some early estimates put it around 8.1. Later seismologists, looking harder, reassessed it upward, closer to 8.6. And the reason for the argument is exactly the thing we talked about earlier. This was, by many accounts, a tsunami earthquake. The shaking it produced was strangely modest for the size of the wave it threw. The ground undersold what the ocean was about to do. 48 minutes after the quake, the wave reached the closest target, Scotch Cap Lighthouse, a reinforced concrete building standing on Unimak Island, roughly 90 feet above the sea. A wave came over it, not up to it, over it. The lighthouse was simply gone, and the 5 Coast Guard keepers inside it were killed instantly. 5 men, in a fortress of concrete, 90 feet up. That was the warning Hawaii never got to hear. Because in 1946 there was no tsunami warning system. None. The wave left Alaska and crossed the open Pacific at around 500 miles an hour, and not a single soul in Hawaii knew it was coming. For about 5 hours, the islands went about their mourning. In Hilo, on the Big Island, the sea did something strange first. It pulled back. The water drained out of the bay, exposing reef and stranded fish that had never been above water in living memory. And here is the heartbreaking part, the part that repeats in every one of these stories. People walked toward it, curious. Some kids went down to look at the flopping fish. They didn't know, because nobody had ever taught them, that a sea suddenly retreating is the ocean inhaling before it strikes. Up the coast, at a little place called Laupahoehoe Point, a schoolhouse sat low on a peninsula right by the water. The students were arriving for the day. When the waves came, they swept across that point and pulled people out to sea. About 24 were killed there, most of them school children and their teachers. Children, on an ordinary Monday, on their way to class. In Hilo itself, the waves marched in as a series, each one larger, and tore the entire downtown waterfront apart. Down at the pier, a cargo ship was tied up, loaded with tons of dynamite. As the surges hit, a dock worker ran out and cut the last mooring line so the ship could escape to open water before the dynamite went up in the middle of town. The ship got free. The man who cut the line did not. That moment was captured in a photograph that survives in the Pacific Tsunami Museum to this day. One person choosing to stay a few seconds too long so a whole town wouldn't burn. When the water finally settled, the toll across the Hawaiian Islands was around 159 people. Different records put it a little higher or lower because the chaos made an exact count impossible. But 159 is the number history settled on. It remains the deadliest tsunami ever to strike the United States. And it changed everything. Out of those deaths came a decision. 2 years later, in 1948, the United States built the system that did not exist that morning. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, headquartered in Hawaii. The entire reason we can talk about a 5-hour window today, the entire reason a green alert means something, traces back to the children of Laupahoehoe and the keepers of Scotch Cap. They paid for the warning system with their lives. Remember that, because in our next story, the warning system existed, it worked, the sirens sounded, and dozens of people died anyway. 14 years later, the ocean came back, and this time, Hilo had a warning. The source was almost unimaginable. On May 22, 1960, off the coast of Chile, the largest earthquake ever recorded on Earth ruptured, a magnitude 9.5. Not 9.5 as in slightly bigger than the others. 9.5 as in nothing before or since has ever matched it on the instrumental record. The rupture tore along hundreds of miles of the South American coast and threw an enormous volume of seafloor upward. The Pacific Ocean had energy poured into it on a scale the modern world had never measured, and this time the system caught it. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center tracked the wave. Forecasters calculated its speed and its arrival. They knew, with real accuracy, that it would reach Hawaii around midnight, roughly 15 hours after the quake. In Hilo, the warning sirens sounded almost 4 hours before the wave was due. The system that the 1946 dead had bought was doing exactly what it was built to do. So why did 61 people still die in Hilo that night? This is the part I need you to really hear, because it's the most important lesson in this entire video, and it has nothing to do with geology. It has to do with people. The first waves that arrived were small, a few feet, disappointing almost, and human nature did what human nature does. People who had evacuated decided the danger had passed and went back home. Others heard there'd been a warning, saw the harmless first surge, and figured the experts had overreacted. Some went down toward the bay to watch. The sirens had cried wolf, or so it seemed. There were scientists out that night too. A team from the US Geological Survey's Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, led by a seismologist named Jerry Eaton, drove down to Hilo Bay specifically to measure the tsunami. They set up on a bridge over the Wailuku River and watched the water with measuring tapes. They saw the bay rise a few feet, then fall, then drop to several feet below normal. And then, from out in the dark bay, Eaton later recalled hearing a sound, a low rumble, like a distant train growing. Moments later they saw it, a pale wall of tumbling water, caught in the dim lights of the town, coming straight at the shore. That third wave, the big one, reached around 35 feet in Hilo Bay. It came in after 1 in the morning, after the all clear had unofficially spread by word of mouth, after people had gone back to their low-lying homes. It crushed the waterfront. It floated houses off their foundations. It knocked out the power, so the town went dark in the middle of the disaster. The Japanese community of Shinmachi, which had been wiped out in 1946 and rebuilt in the exact same low spot, was destroyed a second time. This time, it was never rebuilt. 61 people died in Hawaii that night, and the bitter truth is that the warning had reached almost every one of them. The science worked. The sirens worked. What failed was the gap between hearing a warning and believing it, between the first small wave and the killing wave that came 40 minutes later. That same Chilean wave kept going. It crossed the entire Pacific. 15 hours wasn't even the end of its journey. It reached Japan, more than 10,000 miles from Chile, around a full day later, and killed over 130 people there who had even less reason to expect it. 1 earthquake, 1 ocean, 3 continents grieving. So now we've seen Hawaii twice, the bullseye in the middle of the Pacific. But I told you at the start that some of you live on the coastlines in this story, and so far I've only named islands. Let me bring it home to the mainland. Let me take you to a town on the coast of California that has been hit so many times it has a nickname for it. If you drive up the far northern coast of California, almost to the Oregon line, you'll reach a small harbor town called Crescent City. Fishing boats, redwoods behind it, maybe 7,000 people. It looks like the last place on Earth that would star in a disaster film, and it has been struck by tsunamis so often that locals and scientists alike sometimes call it the tsunami capital of the United States mainland. The worst of them came on Good Friday, 1964. That afternoon, in Alaska's Prince William Sound, the North American continent produced its own great earthquake, a magnitude 9.2, the second largest quake ever recorded anywhere, behind only Chile in 1960. The ground in parts of Alaska dropped or rose by several feet in an instant. Anchorage was torn up, and once again, the seafloor jumped and the Pacific went to work. The wave radiated south down the coast, and because of the way the energy was aimed and the particular shape of the seafloor offshore, a huge amount of that energy funneled straight into Crescent City. Other towns along the California and Oregon coast got bumped. Crescent City got hammered. And here, almost beat for beat, the 1960 mistake repeated itself. The first waves arrived, and they were manageable. People who had moved to high ground came back down. Some business owners returned to their shops near the water to check on things, even to start cleaning up. And then the fourth wave came in. It was the big one. It reached around 20 feet, surged through the downtown, smashed the business district, tossed cars and logs and boats through buildings, and set off fires in the wreckage. About 11 or 12 people were killed in Crescent City that night. The exact number varies slightly depending on the source, but it stands as the deadliest tsunami ever recorded on the mainland west coast of the United States. Not Hawaii. Not a faraway island, California. American soil that a lot of people assume is simply too far north, too cold, too tucked away to ever face something like this. That assumption is the danger. Because notice the pattern that just played out 3 times in a row. 1946, no warning, people walked toward the water. 1960, a real warning, and people came back too soon. 1964, a real warning again, and people came back too soon again. The technology got better every single time. The trench got more predictable to monitor, and the thing that kept killing Americans stayed exactly the same. It was the gap between the first harmless wave and the lethal one behind it. It was the human instinct to believe the danger has passed the moment it stops looking scary. 3 towns, Hilo, twice, Crescent City, once. Hundreds of Americans dead, all of them from earthquakes that happened somewhere else, somewhere most of the victims had never thought about. Alaska, Chile, the Aleutians, the same arc of subduction zones that includes the Kamchatka Trench, the one that just spent this week shaking. That's why a green alert off Kamchatka is not nothing. Not because this week's quake was dangerous. It wasn't. But because it's a reminder, mailed from the exact return address that wrote those other letters, that the system is still active, the fault is still loaded, and the 5-hour window is still real. Now, you might be thinking, all right, but that was the past. We have satellites now. We have buoys. Surely the modern warning system has closed that gap. So let me show you exactly what's watching the deep ocean today, what it can do, and the one thing no amount of technology can fix. Here's a question that probably occurred to you somewhere back in those 3 stories. Why Hilo? Why Crescent City? The Pacific is enormous. Why do the same handful of towns keep getting destroyed while the coastline a few miles away gets off with wet feet? The answer is the shape of the seafloor, and it's one of the most underappreciated parts of this whole hazard. Remember what a tsunami is in deep water. Low, fast, spread through the entire ocean column, barely a bump at the surface. What turns that harmless-looking bump into a killer is the transition into shallow water. And not all shallow water is equal. The geometry of the coast decides how much that wave grows, and where. Think about what happens when you partly cover the end of a garden hose with your thumb. Same amount of water, but you've squeezed the opening, and the stream shoots out faster and harder. A bay can do the same thing to a wave. Hilo Bay, specifically, has a funnel-like underwater shape. As the tsunami enters, the bay narrows and shallows, and all that energy gets pinched into a smaller and smaller space. It has nowhere to go but up. That's why, in 1960, the open coast of other Hawaiian islands saw waves of a few feet, while Hilo Bay was hit by a wall around 35 feet tall. Same ocean, same wave, different geometry. One town pays the bill for the whole island. Crescent City has its own version of this curse. Offshore of that part of the California coast, there are underwater ridges and an irregular seafloor that act almost like a lens. They bend and focus the incoming tsunami energy, the way a magnifying glass focuses sunlight into a hot point, and they aim that concentrated energy right at the harbor. The town doesn't just happen to get hit. The seafloor is shaped to deliver the wave to its doorstep. There's a second effect, too. When a tsunami pours into a confined harbor or bay, the water can slosh back and forth long after the first surge, like water sloshing in a bathtub you've bumped. Scientists call this resonance. The bay has a natural rhythm, and the tsunami sets it ringing. That's part of why these events aren't one wave and done. They're a sequence, sometimes lasting hours, and very often the third, fourth, or fifth surge is bigger than the first. We saw it in 1960. We saw it in 1964. The first wave is not a verdict, it's a question, and the ocean takes its time answering. Once you understand that, you understand why the old instinct, go down and look once the first wave passes, is precisely, exactly the thing that gets people killed. The bay is still ringing. The biggest surge may still be on its way in. Walking back toward the water during a tsunami is like stepping back onto train tracks because the first car already went by. So the geometry decides who gets hurt, and the sequence decides when. Neither of those is something you can change. But there is one thing that has changed dramatically since 1946, and it's the only real defense we have. We can't move Hilo Bay, we can't reshape the seafloor off Crescent City, but we got very, very good at watching the deep ocean, so that the 5-hour silence isn't quite as silent as it used to be. Let me show you the machine that does it. In 1946, the wave crossed the Pacific completely undetected. Today, that same wave would be spotted within minutes. Here's how. It starts with earthquakes, not waves. A global network of seismometers, run in part by the United States Geological Survey, feels a great quake almost the instant it happens. Within a few minutes, analysts know its location, its depth, and a first estimate of its magnitude. And that immediately tells the tsunami forecasters the most important thing. Did the seafloor likely jump? And is this the kind of quake that could launch a wave? For the June Kamchatka aftershocks, the answer was no, and that's a big part of why the green alert came so fast and stayed. But a quake estimate alone isn't enough, because, remember, the shaking can lie. So the system needs to actually detect the wave itself, out in the open ocean, before it reaches anyone. And that's the genuinely clever part. Anchored across the deep Pacific is a network of instruments called DART buoys. The name stands for Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis. Each one is a pair. There's a sensor sitting on the actual seafloor, thousands of feet down, that measures the pressure of the water column above it with astonishing precision. When a tsunami passes overhead, even one that's only a foot or two tall at the surface, the weight of that extra water changes the pressure on the seafloor sensor by a measurable amount. The sensor pings that data up to a buoy floating on the surface, which relays it by satellite to the warning centers. In effect, we've planted tripwires in the middle of the ocean, on the bottom of the sea, to catch a wave nobody can see. Two centers run this for the United States: the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii, the direct descendant of the one built after 1946, and the National Tsunami Warning Center up in Palmer, Alaska, which covers the coasts of Alaska and the continental United States and Canada. Between the seismometers and the DART buoys, they can confirm whether a real tsunami exists, estimate its size, and model its travel time across the basin with real accuracy, often issuing the first message within roughly 5 minutes of a major quake. So has the gap been closed? Are we safe now? Here's the honest answer, and it's the whole reason I keep circling back to those 3 towns. The technology closed one gap and left another wide open. The detection gap, the part between the seafloor moving and us knowing about it, that's been almost entirely solved. We will see the wave coming. But there's a second gap that no satellite can touch. The gap between the warning going out and a human being actually acting on it. That's the gap that killed 61 people in Hilo in 1960, when the sirens had already sounded. That's the gap that killed people in Crescent City in 1964, after they'd already evacuated once. The machine can tell you the wave is coming. It cannot make you stay on high ground when the first surge looks small and your house is right there and your whole life is down by the water. And there's one more uncomfortable limit. The warning system buys you time only when the earthquake is far away. 5 hours from Kamchatka, 15 from Chile. But what about a great earthquake that ruptures right off your own coastline? Then there are no DART buoys far enough out to help, There's no 5-hour window. There might be 10 minutes, or less. And the United States has exactly that kind of fault. It's not in Russia. It's off Oregon and Washington. And it's the closest thing in this entire story to your own backyard. Everything we've talked about, the locked megathrust, the seafloor that jumps, the wave that crosses an ocean, has been happening somewhere else and arriving on American shores hours later. Now I want to show you the same machine, the same physics, sitting just off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. Because the Cascadia subduction zone is the mirror image of Kamchatka, and it runs from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia for roughly 700 miles. It works exactly the way the trench worked. The oceanic plate is sliding under North America. The fault is locked. The crust is bending and storing energy. And here's the thing that took scientists a long time to even believe. For most of modern history, Cascadia has been silent. No great earthquake since the United States has existed. That silence got mistaken for safety. It was the opposite. It was a fault holding its breath. We know it holds its breath because of one of the most beautiful pieces of detective work in all of Earth science. Researchers found ghost forests along the Pacific Northwest coast, stands of dead cedar trees killed when the land suddenly dropped and the sea rushed in. They found layers of sand laid down by an ancient tsunami. They dated it, and then they found the other half of the story on the far side of the ocean. In Japan, there are written records, careful ones, of a tsunami that struck the coast in January of the year 1700. A wave that flooded villages and damaged rice paddies and was logged by local officials. But there was no earthquake. The Japanese felt no shaking. For centuries it was a mystery. They called it an orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent. The parent was Cascadia. On the night of January 26, 1700, the entire Cascadia fault ruptured at once. In an earthquake estimated at around magnitude 9, it dropped the Pacific Northwest coastline, drowned those cedar forests, and launched a tsunami straight across the Pacific that arrived in Japan about 10 hours later, with no warning and no felt quake to explain it. The Japanese records and the American ghost forests are two halves of the same night, written down on opposite sides of the world. That fault has not ruptured since. It's been more than 300 years, and the geologic record suggests Cascadia produces these great earthquakes every few hundred years on average, somewhere in the range of 300 to 500. So it is not a question of whether, it is, genuinely, only a question of when. The scientists who study it are blunt about that. Now connect it back to this week. When Kamchatka shakes, when the Aleutian Arc shakes, those are the distant sources, the ones that give Hawaii its 5 hours and the West Coast even longer. But Cascadia is the local source. If it goes, the people in Seattle, Portland, and the Oregon and Washington coast won't get 5 hours. The shaking itself will be the warning. Long, violent, rolling shaking that lasts not seconds but minutes. And after it stops, the coastal communities will have something like 15 or 20 minutes, maybe less, before the water arrives. No app will save that time, no buoy is close enough. The only warning is the ground itself, and the only plan is to already know in your body that long shaking near the coast means run uphill now. So when I say this is your shore too, I mean it literally. The Kamchatka quakes this week are a distant cousin rehearsing a play that Cascadia will eventually perform off our own coastline. Same fault type, same lifted ocean, same wave. The only differences are the address and the warning time. And one of those differences is not in our favor, which brings us, finally, to the part of the internet that takes all of this and gets it spectacularly, dangerously wrong. Because while the real science is unsettling enough, there's a whole ecosystem online right now telling you something far more dramatic and far more false. Let's talk about what this is not. If you searched for the Kamchatka earthquakes this week, you probably ran into some version of this. A wall of water is about to hit the west coast. The big one has been triggered. The Pacific is waking up and California has days. Maybe you saw a thumbnail with a red arrow and a city under a wave. Let me take these apart one by one, with physics, because the real story is unsettling enough without the garbage layered on top. Claim 1. A transoceanic tsunami is coming for California from these June quakes. This is simply false. We covered why. A magnitude 6.6 aftershock does not move enough seafloor to launch a basin-crossing wave. The USGS and the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center both confirmed no tsunami threat. There is no wall of water crossing the ocean right now. If there were, the dart buoys would already know, and the warning centers would already be screaming. Silence from them is not a cover-up. It's data. Claim 2, the popular one. The Kamchatka quake will trigger the San Andreas, or set off Cascadia, or kick the whole ring of fire into motion. Here's the problem with that, and it's a matter of distance and energy. When a fault ruptures, it does change the stress on nearby faults. That's real. Scientists call it stress transfer, and it can nudge a neighbor that was already close to failing. But the key word is nearby. The effect drops off incredibly fast with distance, within a few times the length of the rupture itself. Kamchatka and California are separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The San Andreas does not feel a Kamchatka quake in any meaningful way. The faults are not connected by some hidden global trigger. They're separate machines on opposite sides of the planet, each loaded by its own slow grind, each on its own clock. Claim 3, the one that powers an entire corner of the internet. Solar flares and space weather are causing the earthquakes. The sun is acting up, the earth is responding, it's all connected. This one I want to be very direct about, because it gets dressed up in scientific language to sound credible. There is no established physical mechanism by which a solar flare triggers a megathrust earthquake. The energy from space weather interacts with our upper atmosphere and our magnetic field. It does not reach down through the crust and unzip a locked fault 10 miles under the seafloor. The strain that breaks these faults was loaded over centuries of plate motion. A burst from the sun is not what tips it. When you see a channel splicing together a flare, a quake, and a storm and calling it a pattern, what you're watching is coincidence dressed as causation. The Earth has dozens of magnitude 5 quakes every single day. You can always find one to pair with anything. Now, here's where I keep my other promise to you. Telling you where the science genuinely is uncertain, because that's different from debunking nonsense. It is true that after a great earthquake, the probability of more large quakes in that same region goes up for a while. That's what an aftershock sequence is, and forecasters model it carefully. It's also an active area of research, how and how much one fault segment loads its neighbors over the long term. Scientists argue about those numbers in good faith. What no credible scientist will do is hand you a date. Nobody can tell you the day the next great one comes, in Kamchatka or Cascadia or anywhere else. The honest position is humility about timing and certainty about eventuality. And that's the part the conspiracy crowd can't sell, because it doesn't fit on a thumbnail. The truth is more unsettling than any of their stories. Nobody is in control. There's no secret schedule, no hidden trigger, no agency hiding the date. The ocean doesn't take orders from the sun or from a government. It answers only to the slow, blind, relentless grind of the plates, and it will send the wave when it sends it, with no regard for whether we're ready. That is so much scarier than a villain. A villain you could at least blame. This you can only prepare for. So let's make this useful. If everything we've covered is true, what do you actually do with it? How do you read the ocean in those quiet hours, the way the people of 1946 didn't know how to? There are two completely different situations, and confusing them costs lives. So let's separate them cleanly. Situation 1. The earthquake is far away. Kamchatka, Alaska, Chile, Japan. You did not feel it. In this case, your warning comes from the system, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, the National Tsunami Warning Center, your phone's emergency alerts, local sirens, the radio. If you live on or are visiting a Pacific coast and an official tsunami warning is issued, you move inland or to high ground, and here is the part that history screams at us. You stay there until officials say it's over. Not until the first wave comes, not until it looks calm. The sequence can run for hours, and the later waves are routinely bigger than the first. The single most repeated fatal mistake in this entire video was people going back too soon. Don't be the person who returns to watch. Situation 2 is the one that gives you no time, and it's where your own body is the warning system. If you are near the coast and you feel an earthquake that is either very strong or that goes on for an unusually long time, a rolling that lasts not a few seconds but a full minute or more, you do not wait for an official alert. You do not check your phone. Long or strong, get gone. Move to high ground immediately, on foot if you can, because roads may be damaged or jammed. For a local source like Cascadia, the shaking is the only warning you will get, and the water may be minutes behind it. And there's nature's own signal, the one the children in Hilo didn't recognize. If the sea suddenly pulls back, draining out of a bay or away from a beach, exposing reef and sand and stranded fish that are never normally uncovered, that is not a curiosity. That is the trough of the tsunami arriving before its crest. The ocean is inhaling. You may have only a minute or two. Turn around and run inland and uphill, and tell everyone around you to do the same. A loud roar from the sea, like a train or a jet, is the same message. That's it. That's the whole survival kit, and notice it requires no gadgets. Know if you're in a tsunami zone. Know where your high ground is. Heed official warnings for distant quakes, and don't come back early. Trust your own body for local ones. Treat a retreating sea as a sprint signal. The green alert this week asked nothing of you. No action, but it's a free reminder to answer one question while it costs you nothing. If you live on a coast, or you're planning a trip to one, do you actually know where your high ground is? Most people never think about it until the sea is already moving. The quiet hours are exactly when that question is supposed to be asked. Let's pull it all together, because I don't want you walking away with either false comfort or false panic. Both are easy. The truth sits in between, and it's more interesting than either. What actually happened off Kamchatka this June was an aftershock sequence. Last summer's magnitude 8.8 ruptured a huge section of that fault and released centuries of stored strain. A rupture that big leaves the surrounding crust adjusting, and those adjustments are the magnitude 6 and 5 quakes we saw this week. They tend to follow a predictable fade, lots of them right after the main shock, then fewer and fewer over months and years, with occasional flare-ups. So in one sense, this week was the fault doing exactly what it's supposed to do as it settles. Routine, expected, green. But here's the part that matters for the long game. When a segment of a megathrust ruptures in a great quake, it largely empties its strain budget. That particular patch is less likely to produce another giant quake again soon, because it just spent its savings. The concern, the thing seismologists actually watch, is the neighbors. A great rupture can load the adjacent segments, the parts of the fault that didn't break, nudging them a little closer to their own day. That's not doom, it's bookkeeping. It's why scientists keep watching this arc long after the headlines move on. And step back to the whole Pacific Rim. The Ring of Fire isn't a single connected machine, but it is a chain of these subduction zones, each one independently loaded, each one with its own strain accumulating right now as you watch this. Kamchatka, the Aleutians, Alaska, Cascadia, Japan, Chile. At any given moment, some of them are quiet, some are settling from a recent rupture, and at least one is silently approaching its limit. We just can't point to which, or say when. That's the real weight of this week's quakes. Not that they were dangerous, they weren't, but that they're a postmark. A reminder sent from one of the most powerful tsunami sources aimed at the United States, that the machine is running, the faults are loaded, and the 5-hour window we talked about is not a historical artifact. It is a live, standing feature of the world we live in, refreshed every single day by plates that do not care that we've forgotten about them. The people of Hilo forgot, twice. They rebuilt Shinmachi in the same low spot after 1946, and the sea took it again in 1960. Forgetting is the most human thing we do, and on a coastline, it's the most expensive. The whole purpose of a video like this is to push that forgetting back a little, to make the quiet hours mean something before the loud ones arrive. So let's go back to where we started. The open question I asked you to hold on to. I told you the wave that should scare you is never the one you can see, and now you know why that's literally true. In deep water, the wave is invisible. By the time it stands up tall enough to see, you're already inside the few seconds where seeing it doesn't help. The decision that saves your life isn't made when the water appears. It's made in the quiet hours, when the sea pulled back and the fish were flopping, and it would have been so easy to walk down and look. The survivors in every one of these stories are, overwhelmingly, the people who moved while nothing looked wrong, who treated the silence as the warning. So here's the honest one-line version of everything we covered. The shaking is the announcement, the wave is the event, and the gap between them is where people live or die. Kamchatka shook this week, and it was green, and that's good. But it shook from the same return address that wrote letters to Hilo and Crescent City in blood. And that fault, and its mirror off our own coast, is still loaded and still on a clock no one can read. I'm not going to end this by telling you a wave is coming next week, because it isn't, and I'd be one of the voices I just spent 10 minutes taking apart. I'm going to end it the way the ocean actually leaves it, unresolved. The Pacific is patient, it has all the time in the world, and we have memories that last about one generation. The sea always comes back. The only thing we get to decide is whether we're still listening when it does. If this was worth your time, the best thing you can do is make sure you'd recognize the signs we talked about, and make sure one other person you care about would too. Send them this. That's the whole point of the channel. Same dread, real data, no fabrication. And if the part that's still sitting in your chest is Cascadia, that quiet fault off the Pacific Northwest that doesn't give you 5 hours but more like 15 minutes, then that's exactly where you should go next. Because there's a night in the year 1700, written down in Japanese records and frozen into a ghost forest in Oregon, that tells you precisely what that fault is capable of, and exactly how little warning the West Coast will get when it finally exhales. That's the story I'd watch before this fault makes the news for real. I'll see you there. This has been the Horizon Lab. Stay on high ground.